My guest is Lenny Montgomery, a writer who has just published her first novel, science fiction, uh, which I like because it isn't all about robots and strange guns, but mainly about people involved in a future far removed from our present. Lenny, why science fiction?
Well, my interest began in 2012, so really in the months leading up to my 30th birthday, actually. CBS Action were showing reruns of Star Trek the original series on a Saturday, so I started watching it and my interest was piqued. It coincided with being in my third year of my Gallic degree, and I was taking a creative writing module, and I wanted to write something different, and was told that Gaelic can only be used to write about things from the Gaelic culture. So, fishing, crofting. I, being a bit of a rebel, decided to challenge that and said I was going to write science fiction, which I did. I got an A. And in fact, that short story I wrote for the creative writing module is the opening sequence that I now use to open Veritas.
Right. When did you start writing? And was it always from the very start science fiction in your mind?
So I began writing about age 5. Yes, I was definitely well before preschool age, learning to both read and write. I do have an exercise book that's actually dated October 1987, in which I was writing what I do like to call my first novel, The Lovely Bears and the Hateful Rat, in big wobbly capital letters. In my teenage years, it was boys' boarding school stories. I read a lot of Harold Avery and Billy Bunter stories, and I liked that kind. Some historical fiction, and then science fiction came later, about 2012, when I got the idea to rebel against mainstream ideals.
Right. Nobody likes this question, but how would you describe yourself?
Yeah, that is always a really difficult question. I think I would describe myself as a bit of an academic. I like the study and research side of everything. I'll always read, I'll always study. The writing side of things, there's always a lot of research goes into whatever I'm doing. Even if it's reading a menu that's never going to feature, I like to know what the characters would be eating. When I'm asked what I do for work, I'll always say author. Sometimes I actually forget to mention my official work. Writing comes first.
How do you see science fiction as a genre in the future?
Oh, that is a good question. I would actually like to see it accepted as legitimate literature. Science fiction does carry a stigma, and people generalise that people who like science fiction tend to be single men of between 30 and 40 years old, still living in their old mother's basement. They generally probably have personal hygiene issues and non-existent social skills. People act really shocked if a woman likes science fiction. You get called geeky or nerdy, and they're not meant to be complimentary. You get people say, I don't read that stuff, as if science fiction is a taboo. So I would like to see everybody accepting and being able to read and enjoy science fiction as stories that they can escape into far-off worlds.
How do you perceive the future in terms of science fiction?
Well, so much of the technology we have now is actually inspired by science fiction that's gone before. Star Trek inspired the mobile phones that we first had, the ones that flipped open, like the communicator you see on the original series. Their personal computers were called pads, iPad. The Edinburgh University's been working on developing a bio bed that a patient can lie on, and it will scan them, and it's actually be able to pick up on things that doctors can't see, because then they get a full diagnostic, like when you put your car into the garage and they run all those tests things. Robotics, there's so much development. It used to just be the idea of robots were going to be the things that would take over the human race and attack humans. And then they've developed them to be that would go under a car to look for a bomb during the Irish Troubles, and developing the idea of robotics that might be the ones that go out and lay mines or mine sweep. And you know, they're even looking at driverless buses. So it's going to, you know, in big city centres they'll have bus lanes that are just a bus that's robotic. And in my work, what I like to do is I look at what is, what's gone before, what have we had, what is being worked on. So I get scientific magazines, I read up on what is going, I like to keep myself up to speed on robotics, and what could be done with it in the future. Look at what's being done and whack some craziness on it that is, you know, could happen when I'm setting my stories 800 years from now. Anything could happen.
Nobody can argue.
No, I use a what if approach.
Right.
I'm not saying it's going to happen.
In those far off days, do you see yourself as a leader?
Yes, probably a bit like a, you know, Nancy Blackett, a pirate ship in space. She was always a favourite character of mine. I do often end up in situations where I am a leader. I have lots of younger siblings, so I would invent stories and games for them to play. At school, I was teams captain, I was a prefect. At work, I'm usually one of the most experienced, so I end up doing a lot of training with people. So, yeah, I kind of do see myself like that.
Right. Now, what influences your writing?
I'd say one of the biggest influences is my imagination, which to some people is probably a crazy one with the stories that come out of it. I see a story unfold as though I'm watching the action like a movie. Sometimes actually I hear appropriate music, so a fight scene, it will be a particular kind of music. Always having been a reader, there are definitely some writers who have influenced my writing, perhaps even my style a little bit. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island, of course, which is, I think, the first non-picture book that I remember reading, and I was captivated by the sense of adventure and the thrill. I always remember the scene with Israel Hands climbing up with his, you know, his knife between his teeth, and you not knowing what's going to happen. You kind of think Jim Hawkins is going to die at that point. Even as a child, you probably think that. Charles Dickens, Sir Walter Scott, they're definitely influences in the use of language to convey a picture. And of course Star Trek, that's been a big inspiration. Anyone reading my work is going to see little similarities. They'll see the influence if they know Star Trek. But I would say that I'm perhaps darker, not twisted, but definitely darker. In Star Trek, you kind of know the main character will be okay. I like to make that concept slightly more tense.
Ooh. Now, is your book, Veritas, is it a standalone or one of a series? Or can we expect to see some of the characters returning?
It is book one of a planned trilogy. There may even end up being more than 3, which is why I prefer to use series rather than trilogy. It originally was going to be one book, but I grew really attached to the characters as I wrote them, and I got more ideas, and I'm definitely not ready to let them go. So yes, you can definitely expect to see characters returning, possibly even taking on the mantle of main character, and I absolutely cannot guarantee that main characters are safe. If a death is necessary to the plot, anything can happen.
Oh, wow. Well, it's been very interesting. I thank you, Lenny Montgomery. It's very, very nice, very elucidating here, interesting, and wish you well for the future.
Thank you very much.